So we're now entering Unit 9 for AP Environmental Science. According to the College Board, it's not going to be on the exam this year, but there is a lot of overlap, and it's a good way to summarize the rest of what you've learned this year. The reason why I like to talk about this unit is it kind of wraps everything up with a positive note. One of our first lessons, though, today's lesson is going to be on economics. It's weird. People often wonder, why do we talk about economics in environmental science? It's because if we use economics to justify environmental degradation, we also should be able to find ways to use economics to justify protecting the environment. As one person said in college one time, if you're not willing to learn economics, you can't sit at the big person table to have policy decisions that sound at all rational. This, by the way, is my little niece when she was younger on a fishing trip, visiting my parents. One would say that the fish she's catching really is not worth any money. They might also point out that a picture like this, they would say, is priceless. One thing we'll talk about is this concept called valuation. Even though the picture itself is priceless, and technically there doesn't look like there was much going on there, there was the gas money my sister spent to get her daughter up there. There was the shopping spree my dad went on to get Clara a new fishing rod. And additionally, there is the hospital bill of someone getting a fishhook stuck in their nostril that was not Clara. So sustainability is the main goal of environmental science. And we always say things should be sustainable, but then we don't quite define it because it's hard to define it. The idea is you don't screw over future generations. A lot of indigenous tribes call it the 7-generation rule, meaning a decision is sustainable if it still makes sense and is still not screwing things up 140 years or 7 generations later. The reason I'm calling it the Menominee definition is this is the Menominee River Indian Reservation, and the tree that you're seeing there getting logged is actually from one of the most sustainable, or it is currently the most sustainable forest practice in the world. They set up their cutting cycle on a 7-generation rule cutting cycle. For the first 100 years, everybody wondered why they didn't just liquidate their forests, but now they're one of the few places where you can cut down 140-year-old white pine and cedar while it's still sustainable. So the wood is actually skyrocketed in value, showing that being sustainable actually can be lucrative as well. And by the way, that is the welcome to the reservation sign. And yes, they intentionally have the little dig of over 140 years of sustainable forest management. But economics are weird. We are actually seeing economics right now with the fluctuating prices on things like gasoline and surgical masks, all as a result of this epidemic. Supply and demand combine to make the market, and weird things happen. One thing we talked about with diamonds is there are more diamonds than people actually want. That's why when you sell a used diamond, people are shocked that it has lost over half of its value. This is done by diamond companies having limited release of diamonds onto the world market every year. So if you have high supply and low demand, the value of something goes down. If you have low supply and high demand, like surgical masks, that price goes up. Right now, gasoline is going down because no one's really driving anywhere because of this social distancing we're doing. This is one of my favorite potters, Warren McKenzie. His goal was to make functional pottery that people would use. The problem was everybody wanted his stuff, so because of supply and demand, it became really valuable. So he started mass producing it, still with his own hands, trying to flood the market, but the stuff wouldn't go down in value. He finally became so frustrated, he stopped putting his name on pieces because he wanted people to buy his pottery to use it, not just to put it on a shelf. Externalities can hide the true cost of something. For example, you'll often hear like, why I would go organic, but it's more expensive than having store-bought or standard food. The reason why organic food is more expensive is merely because of subsidies. The corn that is grown to make Kellogg's Corn Flakes gets more federal subsidies than the corn that is organic because organic food just tends to be a lower niche market and doesn't get quite as much money. Another example of an externality is like negative or positive. Sometimes there's benefits, sometimes there's major drawbacks. The McDonald's dollar menu. Yes, you could save a lot of money if you ate on the McDonald's dollar menu, but the health problems that it would cause you later in life would be a negative externality. So we see these quite often in economics. Going with this, we also, when we're talking about the wealth of a country, you'll often hear people talk about the GDP. And this is what you'll often hear mentioned, like the US is falling behind in the GDP. It's the total value of everything produced and spent in a country, including spending, investments, government spending, exports minus imports. Right now, because of COVID-19, we're not spending a lot. So you're hearing a lot of people talk about the economy, even though there's more important things like people's health right now that matter more. The weird thing about GDP is it's not the best measure. For one reason, if you look at the countries that exceed the US in GDP, they are riddled with problems with infrastructure, as well as healthcare issues and human rights issues and environmental degradation. So another way to think about the GDP is this. If we all went to McDonald's and lived entirely on McDonald's, we would all get so sick and we would spend so much money on healthcare that we would actually raise the US GDP. So the GDP might not be the best indicator of economic productivity, because healthcare costs increase GDP. Environmental costs don't affect GDP, but if they're expensive to clean up, like Love Canal, then they can raise the GDP as well. So poor diet can even increase GDP. Massive pollution things increase GDP. One thing the World Bank recommends instead is the Genuine Progress Indicator, which fuses GDP with things that look a little esoteric but are more sustainable. What is the personal consumption rate of people in that country? Is the income distribution good? Right now, the US doesn't measure well in income distribution because of just the large amount of assets being controlled by just a small percentage of the country. The levels of higher education and access to education, resource depletion, pollution levels, public health, and access to healthcare. And this graph is kind of a cool graph. This actually is showing the red is GDP in the US, the black is GPI in the US. And this was predicting major economic collapses in the late 90s and early 2000s. And as you can see, the GPI made a better prediction that things weren't looking so good. So another thing we talk about in environmental science is Kuznets curve. As per capita income in a country increases and environmental degradation first increases, then eventually decreases. So to show you that on this graph, if we go here and we follow this, let me get my cursor handy. This would be the US until about the moment the Cuyahoga River caught fire near Lake Erie. In the late 60s, early 70s was our turning point where until recently, our environmental degradation started decreased and the environment started improving. And this happens as a country goes through what we talked about earlier this semester, demographic transition. So the concept with this is as a country becomes developed, economically developed, it's going to go through this, really screw things up for a little while, and then it gets better. And remember, about 80% of the world is currently not fully developed. Now, before you have a creepy thought that you think that we should keep other countries from getting developed, the actual solution is just finding ways to reduce this curve. I'm sorry, you're probably tired of hearing that now. Reducing the curve here is from sharing technology. And that we call that a technology transfer, and that's leapfrogging. And we're seeing this a lot. A lot of developed countries like Costa Rica kind of skipped most of the infrastructure of fossil fuel consumption. They went right to solar and wind and hydroelectric, even though hydroelectric does have some problems. Newly developed regions of the world have skipped coal power plants and have gone right to solar energy. Some countries have never had land phone lines, but they went right to cell phones. And we call that leapfrogging. We should not have to expect every civilization to invent their own light bulb when we already have one that works. We can just keep improving on it and sharing technology. Right now, this technology transfer is happening with COVID-19 as China is, in fact, sharing medical supplies and access to support materials and advice on how they dealt with the epidemic. Microlending is another cool economic solution. It's loaning small amounts of money to people intent to start a small business in less developed country. Because when you want to borrow some money to start a business, the bank's going to ask you for collateral. In the case of some developing countries, families only need a little bit of money to start a small business. In this case, this woman's fruit stand. She had no collateral. She ended up paying back her microloan within a year, and now she's supporting her entire family as they go to college. And the difference that she needed was just a microloan of a few $100s, which most banks will not give. So microloans there are websites that allow you to do it, but make sure you go through them carefully because some have been a little corrupt. The real microloan companies or programs have a higher payback rate than home mortgages in the United States. So the cool thing about these is this helps so many things as a country becomes economically developed. It gives greater access to education. It empowers women. It also helps encourage better environmental practice. As we talked about earlier this year, once you provide access to education, especially to women, it lowers fertility rates and the population stabilizes. It also helps support local markets. Less fuel is used to transport goods, and so there are a lot of great benefits with this. Now, another thing to talk about with economic health is measuring all forms of natural and human natural capital and basic welfare. So these are all things that have value. The weird thing in a lot of developed countries, this is the only one we say has value. All goods and services produced. This is what GDP is. Natural capital is things like air, water, soil, and minerals, human knowledge, human abilities. The country of Ecuador has given its the environment in its country rights of its own to protect its natural capital. So, and environmental and ecological economics have some problems, and those are called market failures when we don't account for all costs. So, environmental economics studies the costs and benefits of policies and regulations on potential environmental degradation. But so to put it in a different way, it just treats economics as a component of ecology rather than a separate one. And the goal is to preserve natural capital. Now, this seems like crazy hippie stuff, but this is what the Menominee River Indian Reservation did in northern or in central Wisconsin. And their forestry practice is the most profitable per acre in the world now. So one way we deal with market failures is valuation. And valuation is an amazing thing. It is putting value on things that we used to say was priceless. And one of the worst things we say in environmental science is you can't put a price on a sunset. When I was in college, one of my professors said it, and we were all hippies in the class going, he's so deep. And then this young woman in the front row, at the time she was old for us because she had a grown-up job. She'd been a realtor and she was in her 20s. Her hand shot up and she's like, we have put a price on a sunset. It's 50% of the resale, 50% of the resale value of your house if you have a sunset view. And then she added, all these other things that we had considered intangible. And she was the one who looked at everybody and said, just because you haven't put a price on it doesn't mean we haven't. And if we don't put a price on it and we just say it's priceless in economics, that means it has no value. So even though human life is priceless, like there isn't economic value to it, or there is no way you can ask for retribution if something's been damaged. So this is how valuation works. Here's more pictures of the fishing trip with a possible hospital visit afterwards. Even though there was no money truly spent in the value of that and the memories are priceless, all the money Dad spent getting bait ready and getting new fishing rods, the gas to get up there, as well as even the pizza party that they needed afterwards to help them go to sleep, all of those things threw money into the local economy. That money would not have gone into the local economy if the biology of that lake wasn't supporting fish that the kids could catch. And here's another example of a market failure. Oh, wait, we'll go to that. So with valuation, a lot of environmentalists are doing this. When I've done some outdoor ski races, when I finish them, I've received surveys asking me how much money did I spend in these regions on these races. I found out afterwards that some of the surveys were used because they were going to tear up this 30-mile ski course for the Birkebeiner to make it more accessible to a mine until they realized how much money the ski race brought to the community was more than the mine would ever bring. Here's another example of market failure. As you're younger, The cheaper tire looks like the better tire. And by the way, Tiger Paws I think are up to 186, and they're awesome. When I was in grad school, I got these tires because I was broke. Because you need 4 tires, and they broke and busted and leaked all the time. I spent about $100 a year in repairs on them, and within 3 years, another tire shop said that they couldn't safely repair them again and told me it was time to get new tires. By that time, I had spent about $800 in the money I'd saved, and I hadn't saved that much. The next tires I bought were these that the tire shop recommended. They lasted for 7 years with no repairs, no leaks, and no flat tires. So in the long run, if I had accounted for repairs and replacement of tires, these would have been the cheaper tires. So another problem with economics is it tends to focus evaluation on resource use and consumption. It doesn't value doing things right. So we have some agencies that help protect things to make things better. So we protect our natural and human capital with agencies like the EPA and the Endangered Species Act, as well as with regulations like Fire Code and OSHA. All these things are really there to keep us safer and to protect things that otherwise would not be in anyone's economic interest to keep safe. When people get on the regulating end, where they're the ones getting regulated, they start lashing out. We talked about this with Tragedy of the Commons, and I'll review that at the tail end. One of the solutions for humans' tendencies to overexploit common shared resources, if the damage is collectively shared but the profit is individualized, one of the solutions is coercion and regulation. But actually, no, we'll go back to that. We'll do Tragedy of the Commons right now. Okay, so Tragedy of the Commons does tie in with this. Sorry for that bad edit. I talked about at the beginning of the semester. This was Garrett Hardin, and this is an underlying thing through economics and environmental science and human society. So the commons are any collectively shared resource. Here is commons, which was feudal land in Great Britain. This was owned collectively by the community, and everybody could put as many cows as they wanted. You got the direct sale off of your cows or the dairy from them. The dilemma is everybody shared the land. So it was in everybody's interest to have as many cows as possible, which would lead to mass erosion and mass destruction of these feeding grasses. So the commons are anything that's collectively owned or shared resource that can be exploited. And we're talking about this, it's anything that is communal. And what happens is when we have a shared resource, everybody tries to optimize their benefits when we all collectively share in the loss of these benefits. And so just imagine if I pulled all of you and each cow is worth $1,000, how many cows would you all want to graze on this shared land that we all collectively shared? Initially, some of you would have low numbers, but 1 or 2 people is all it's going to take to screw it up, and then it becomes competitive where everybody wants more. We see the same thing with lots of other examples of communal resources. Here in Fort Collins, when people roll coal, even though everyone else is doing a lot of effort to improve air quality, just those few yahoos rolling coal increases asthma risks for everyone in this community. So when we're dealing with share of loss, it could be anything. It could be degradation of air quality in the case of humans, or degradation of water quality, or just that upstream community causing the downstream community to flood more or polluting the downstream community's water. One valid example that I just saw this week were 6 doofuses playing beer pong in front of their house. They didn't all live at the house, and they were sharing one ping pong ball for beer pong in the middle of a pandemic. So even though almost everyone else is being judicious about not doing any social contact and keeping everybody at home, that group of 6 is putting everyone in danger, including emergency responders. So there's lots of examples of Tragedy of the Commons. The thing that Garrett Hardin wanted everyone to understand is the two solutions for tragedy of the commons are consequences and incentive. Consequences meaning there's a penalty if you do something wrong. Incentive is we pay you to do things right. And you could also think about that as bribery extortion. And this is all wonderful until someone gets consequences who didn't want to get consequences, and then they go on tirades about a nanny state or big brother controlling them. Other examples, just that we have of public lands and shared resources would be public forest lands, national parks. Mining is done a lot on public lands, and lakes and any navigable water is considered a common resource. If it's deep enough to float a canoe, as long as you're not touching the shoreline, it's public property. Now, one thing when we're dealing with regulating tragedy of the commons, and you saw this a lot in January and February with a lot of inaction, when we're dealing with something that could be a communal response. Another concept that we talk about is precautionary principle. When you aren't sure that what could happen, assume the risk for danger and act accordingly. For example, you don't just wear a seatbelt on the day you're planning on having a car accident, you wear it with the hope that you never need to use the seatbelt. So sadly, the CDC had their pandemic response team cut to save money. In the long run, we're going to see it didn't save us much money. But the attitude was, if you could do something to prevent it, that's great. One thing you'll see is if the social distancing works really well, we're following the precautionary principle. And if it works really well, it will look like we overreacted. The same can be said for how humans respond to things like global warming, the hole in the ozone layer, or even locally, sliding on ice. Sure, you can slide on ice and you might be fine, but one time you might slip and really hurt yourself. Or avalanche shoots as well. Now, back to environmental worldviews. There's three types of worldviews. Anthropocentric is human-centered, where that could be if Clara was holding this fish going, these fish are mine. So biocentric would be Clara saying, these fish have a right to exist because they're fish. Ecocentric would be Clara saying, can we put these fish back because they're part of the ecosystem? Now, other than not saying the word ecosystem, that's actually what she said, and she wanted the fish to go back in the lake. Now, these worldviews have different moments at different times, and all are valid approaches. One example of when things get sticky is if you're dealing with an invasive plant, the biocentric approach is it has a right to exist as a living organism. We need to let it be. The ecocentric approach is it's not part of this ecosystem and therefore it must be eradicated. Fusing all three and finding the balance is a form of deep ecology. Now, world agencies that help regulate and do the coercion include things like United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization. The United Nations Environment Program, and the United Nations has another branch called the Development Program. And yes, they do the pretentious European spelling. So, United Nations Environment Program, they do a lot of things to work on the Endangered Species Act. So the international endangered species thing is called, it is very stringent. They don't ask how you got it. They're saying you can't have it if it's an endangered species. They negotiate treaties. They helped actually figure out the most recent ivory trade problems. They also follow environmental information. The development program advocates for change that will help people obtain a better life through development. The World Bank provides technical and financial assistance to countries with to reduce poverty, to promote development, especially poor nations. Now, often people will say, well, a country should just get developed on their own time. Why should we help them? One thing to understand is when a country is not fully developed, they have lower access to healthcare. And as we already talked about with things like infectious diseases, that disease can still get on a plane and get here. Helping them helps us. One of the goals of the World Bank is to create educate government officials. They will create infrastructure, things like clean water, streets, access to education, developing financial systems that are stable, and combating corruption. The World Health Organization you've been hearing a lot about lately, Their goal is to improve human health by monitoring and assessing health trends and providing medical advice, including combating infectious disease. And despite what you might be hearing on news or on the radio or on Facebook posts, the World Health Organization did, in fact, notify the US about the possible COVID 19 pandemic in December of 2019. Their goals are to promote development that leads to improved health, fighting outbreaks, which they're obviously working on aggressively right now. They did approach the US in February offering access to COVID 19 tests, which we refused. So they also strengthen healthcare. They do a lot of research. Right now, they're leading the research effort to find a vaccine and a cure for COVID 19, as well as enhancing partnerships. Now, the US has a few agencies also dealing with regulating the tragedy of the commons. We're going to start with the EPA. Their goals include science, research, assessments, education, and regulation. Sadly, we're now in a time where the current head of the EPA has less science background than you do, which is problematic. But all of these things generally will work themselves out. In the case of the EPA, even though the heads of it do not have much of a science background, the employees there are very trustworthy and working hard. When a lot of their information on climate change was getting censored, they all posted it online on free websites so it wouldn't get erased. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is one reason why I never let you eat in my classroom, because it actually classified my classroom as a lab and said you are not able to eat in there. It enforces health and safety regulations to prevent injuries and or infections at the workplace. And then the Department of Energy. Its goals are to regulate energy use, maintain energy and economic security, research, discovery, development, innovation, and responsibility. In the past 10 years, the Department of Energy put a lot of money and effort into supporting renewable energy like wind and solar. That seed money has been pivotal, and now we're seeing a massive increase in production of wind and solar in the United States. So that completes your basic lesson on economics. There'll be more coming later in the week.